give a warm welcome to the hosts of The Bride of Alternate Ending.
Hello, ghouls and goblins, and welcome back to Bride of Alternate Ending. I'm Brennan Klein, here, as always, with Tim Brayton. How are you doing today, Tim?
I'm doing so good, Brennan. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Look, I'll have you as often as I can.
Well, we don't need to talk about that in front of everybody on the air.
No, that's totally fair. But what we do need to talk about is that this month on the alternate ending horror sideshow that is us, we have a theme suggested by Patreon Oscar-level patron Gavin McDowell, who wanted us to discuss the films of Ray Harryhausen, which is something that I'm always willing to dive into, even though we will talk about where these films intersect with horror in the first place. But we are here to talk about the film 20 Million Miles to Earth from 1957.
Yes, and this is... It is, as we'll get into, sort of the genre we're working in and how it, again, as you said, how it intersects with horror. But this is interesting to me because I would say that the single most prominent genre of, genre films in the 1950s in the United States was the alien lands on Earth, runs around town freaking everybody out, and they have to fight the alien film. I think it's just, they're everywhere in the 50s. And this is somehow the only one of those that Harryhausen ever made in his career. It is not something that he just was interested in or something he had opportunities to do. I'm not really sure. But I find that fascinating that we have this extremely prominent subgenre of science fiction in the 50s, and we have this extremely prominent visual effects designer, probably the single biggest celebrity effects designer of his generation, and he only intersected with that storytelling form, but the one time.
That is really interesting. Do you think it has something to do with the amount of money that was given to that particular subgenre?
I'm not sure where your head is going when you ask that question.
Well, I mean, it's a lot cheaper to put a burlap sack on somebody's head and put googly eyes on it than to hire Ray Harryhausen to do special effects.
That's true, but it's also cheaper to have cardboard glued to an iguana than to have Ray Harryhausen do a dinosaur for you. Yet.
No, you're right.
I think it's just that it's possible that there were so many of them that he worked a lot with the same producer, Charles Schneer, and maybe he just felt that the market was too saturated and they wouldn't be able to stand out. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And the director of 20 Million Miles to Earth, he's kind of lived in this kind of budget area for a while. Go
ahead.
Oh yeah, it's Nathan Durian. You can say what you're saying.
No, I was going to say his film immediately prior to 20 Million Miles to Earth, also from the year 1957, is a film called The Deadly Mantis, which is sort of a perfect example of the low-budget monster movie of the 50s in a way that is considerably less ambitious in every conceivable way and considerably less effective in every conceivable way than 20 Million Miles to Earth. So definitely Nathan Durian is not a person you go to because you want to spend lots of money on a very artful film. He's kind of a cranks it out quickly effects. He does effects movies for the most part. I mean, if you look at his career, you see a lot of things that have various monsters, various spaceships. But he did work 3 or 4 times, I believe 3 times total with Ray Harryhausen. This was their first collaboration, and they would work together again the following year for The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, and then a few years later for First Men in the Moon. So this is a man who works sort of on and off with Ray Harryhausen.
Well,
and also, weirdly, is an Oscar winner for designing the art directing for How Green Was My Valley in 1941.
This man's career is all over the place. I think maybe his strength is in getting out of Ray Harryhausen's way. Maybe that's why they collaborated so many times. But also, let me double check, because wait, so he didn't direct How Green Was My Valley? Because I thought I saw that on his page.
How Green Was My Valley was for sure directed by John Ford.
Got it. Okay, so let me double check, because I think I was on the wrong section. Okay.
He was the art director, so the word director shows up in his title, but not the directing director.
No. I'm aware, but I was doing my preliminary IMDb research on him, and I think I was maybe on the wrong section, so I was double checking before I said this. But no, he did also direct Attack of the 50-Foot Woman in '58, which is one of my favorite of that subgenre of movies.
And I would be inclined to say that is possibly, setting aside the fact that any film that Ray Harryhausen did the effects for kind of automatically becomes more prominent, I would say that Attack of the 50-Foot Woman is probably his most prominent film.
Oh yeah, I would say so. I think that's definitely one of the like go-to like set decoration movie posters that I've seen, throughout like other films and also just people's apartments and whatever. Like that is a very recognizable poster.
For sure.
And it's a movie that is very much more about how women lived in the 50s than I expected when I first watched it, and I really like that.
Definitely.
Anyway, we're not here to talk about Attack of the 50-Foot Woman. One day I'll finagle it so that we can. But we are here to talk about 20 Million Miles to Earth. We kind of already talked about the plot. It's really not complicated.
No, this is one of the beautiful things about a lot of Ray Harryhausen's films is they basically tell a story, and that's what they do. And the stories are very, very straightforward. But even so, what is the story of this film?
Okay, so we are off the coast of Sicily, or just outside Sicily, right? There's a title card that I don't remember the specifics of right now.
It's an island off the coast of Sicily,
yes,
if I understand it correctly.
Okay, great. Instantly, things start to happen. There's a fishing boat populated by people who are meant to be Italians but are kind of cartoon Italian Americans, which is interesting. And this big spaceship crash lands in the ocean. The fishing crew saves 2 of the crew members of the ship, and a little boy who's with them discovers that washed up on the shore is this kind of disgusting gooey pseudopod that contains a little baby alien inside.
That is getting us very quickly into the plot of this film. Yes, we didn't even talk about how the very stentorian sounding narrator at the start of the movie informs us that this is a story that originates from a place 20 million miles to Earth, which is I don't believe an accurate description of how far Earth is from the planet Venus.
I was reading in the IMDb trivia, which is my source for all scientific information.
Of course.
I think it's like 23 million miles, so they rounded
down.
down.
Actually, that's closer than I thought it was.
Yeah, I think they got in the ballpark.
Okay, I thought it was like 8 million.
I cannot confirm nor deny, but that's what IMDb told me.
No, that's good. We'll assume it's correct.
Yeah, I mean, we have to. I will say, despite that, the title is a huge misnomer because we're on Earth the entire fucking time. So it's just kind of describing how far the alien came to get here rather than anything about the plot of the movie.
Which, that's fair. I mean, it's, I'd never thought about it until this second. So this is not a fully developed theory. I like that, though, because it sort of centers the film's perspective on the alien, which I will at least be sort of suggesting is the correct way to think about this movie, that the alien is the protagonist.
Yeah, I would say that the film kind of feints toward a King Kong, like, sympathy towards the monster at the end, like, the whole 'twas beauty killed the beast situation, but doesn't quite get there in execution. But I definitely think that's the way to read the movie that's most humane, I guess.
I mean, it's clearly a less sophisticated piece of storytelling than King Kong, and even within that, I don't necessarily know that the alien, who's not named in the film, but is called the Ymir, Ymir. This is sort of the phrase that has been given to us down the years is how they refer to the creature during their production. Emir does not have King Kong's, like, clear level of personality. Like, I don't get the sense that there are thoughts going on in this creature's head. But I also feel like, in some ways, the only satisfying way for me to watch the third act of this film is as a panicked animal just trying to escape. and that's sort of where emotionally I find myself landing is feeling the animal, like the Emir's panic more than whatever's going on with any of the humans, who are not bad humans. They're better than a lot of B picture humans from the 50s, but they're certainly not. The fact that I can tell you neither the names of the characters nor the names of the actors without having them right in front of me is both telling and just kind of par for the course for this sort of movie.
Absolutely. And I would say the film explicitly lays out that this monster does not eat people or animals. It eats sulfur.
Yep.
And it is only, aggressive when provoked. So it is laying track for that reading of the film, and I think it does. I don't know, like, by the end, it's a 50s monster movie, so the monster has to be destroyed, and then humans get to pretend that there was a thematic through line the entire time by saying, oh, what a cost it takes for man to lead itself into the future, or whatever.
Right.
But you're right, this is... I mean, I have seen plenty of these sci-fi B pictures from this time, and I wouldn't say any of the human plots are particularly engrossing most of the time, but this is one of the most aggressively bland ones you're gonna see.
I mean, there are some depths of blandness that you get to in 50s B movies, so I might needle you back on that one, just because I think there's at least one point of distinction here, and we'll get into it, I assume, pretty quickly. But yeah, no, this is not a film where the humans are our route to the monster. They are not psychological actors whose arc over the film we are to be invested in. That's just not the goal.
No,
at all.
And that's perfectly okay. Like that's the function of humans in this, because they just, you can't afford to have a monster on screen the whole time. So you got to be looking at something. And those somethings are Colonel Robert Calder, played by William Hopper, and Marissa Leonardo, played by Joan Taylor, who acted in a lot of films, but also is credited for the story for the Matthew Perry rom-com Fools Rush In from 1997, and I want to know what happened.
That is fascinating, and that is perhaps a story we will never know the details of, but I'm very pleased that you dug that one up.
Yeah, she is a figure that I'm very curious about, and I hope I can do some deep Googling later on.
Yes.
So basically she is the daughter of this doctor who is a zoologist living in this place around Sicily in a trailer, and basically the little boy who discovers the alien pseudopod brings it to him, sells it to him so he can buy a cowboy hat because he loves the country of Texas. That's his whole thing.
Yes.
And basically the doctor takes it to Rome to either study it or have it be gawked at. It is one or the other. And Marissa and the Colonel fall in love while they kind of talk about an alien.
Pretty much. That's pretty much the plot. There is a point at which the monster sort of goes on a rampage throughout Rome, because you don't come to a movie like this to watch a monster sit quietly in a cage for an hour. You do expect at some point it's going to burst out and start knocking buildings over and wreaking havoc and having things blow up behind it. And as part of that rampage, does loose an elephant out of the zoo and gets into an elephant fight. And that is certainly one of the things that I think we do not see too many of in these kinds of films. Of course, the elephant, which we initially see as a real-life elephant on camera, very quickly is taken over by a stop-motion effect, so we get two creatures fighting each other that way. And that's part of perhaps why we don't usually see large zoo animals fighting monsters, is because you need a Ray Harryhausen type to really carry that off. But I do enjoy it's colorful in a way that I was not expecting the first time I saw this movie, to have an elephant versus Ymir battle. It's got kind of like low-key version of a kaiju fight. And this is a point at which it's okay to start talking about kaiju films. Godzilla has been imported into the United States by this point, but these kind of monster fights are generally between monsters, not between one monster and just a big earth animal. Which is also part of the reason that I think it's easier for me to read the Emir as just kind of like a panicked animal than anything else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think does it have a body count like at all in terms of human victims. Like it kills a dog that attacks it.
It kills a dog because the farmer it attacks early on does not die, I don't believe.
Yeah, so yeah, no, this monster is not interested in destroying us. You're right. Like I in no way disagree with you, but it's just like this is a 50s movie, so we do have to destroy it, and there's that grimness.
Well, it's also tearing the fuck apart in Rome. So
yeah.
we need Rome.
And
Rome's a good city.
It's fascinating to me that they actually were shooting in Italy, at least for parts of this film.
Were they?
Yeah, so I looked it up because I assumed that they were shooting in Southern California like every other one of these movies. But there are multiple reports that Ray Harryhausen, Adam Sandler style, agreed to do the movie because he had always wanted to go to Italy, and this was the only way he could afford to do it.
Oh, that is fascinating.
And I was looking up the filming locations, and obviously there are shots filmed at a soundstage in Simi Valley or something. But it seems like most of the exteriors were actually filmed in Italy, as far as I could research.
That is not something I knew. I think it just never crossed my mind that this wasn't just like the hills outside of Santa Monica or something. So I was just like, yeah, it's Southern California. That's wild.
Yeah, no, and that's really
I love that.
That's really fascinating, and it does, at least for me, it lent a different character to the exteriors in this film, because I do, every year I watch at least 3 of these, because for my blog I swap, I do kind of a crossover with Hunter Allen, who's a alternate ending commenter and reader. He has his own blog where he does, well, part of what he does is 50s sci-fi, and every year he gives me 3 to review every October. And basically every one of those movies that I've been watching, and we've been doing this for almost 10 years, no matter where they're set, I'm like, nope, that's the dry brush in the Hollywood Hills. Like every single film, it has that kind of consistent landscape wherever it's meant to be. And this movie doesn't have that, and that lends it a very interesting texture from the beginning.
Oh, for sure. And like I said, I assumed that it was just that they went a little bit further inland than the Hollywood Hills, but I'm glad to know that it's actually an international production. That's very cool. I admire, again, these aren't expensive films. Like none of these Ray Harryhausen, Charles Schneer productions are like big Hollywood A pictures, but they get more money spent on them than the other marauding alien / monster / whatever movies from the 50s. So I'm glad they were able to spend a little bit of money to actually go out into the world and do some location work in Europe. That's very cool.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know to what degree it was, because I don't imagine that they were filming in the Colosseum, Like, there are lots of things that they're still faking, of course.
Sure.
But I definitely want to look into what exactly we're actually seeing on film.
Yeah. I have a book on the films of Ray Harryhausen that I should probably use as more of a reference than I necessarily do, but it would be worth sort of digging into and see if I can find any more information about that.
Yeah, well, if you do, we can report back on our next episode.
We sure could.
Who knows if we will? Not me. But yes, so I mean, ultimately, yes, it's a monster movie. Let's talk about the humans, get them out of the way.
Well, I think yes. Also, like there is not a whole lot of there, but I did say there's one specific thing that I think gives this movie a little bit of character that I think is cool and worth talking about. So you mentioned we have this pair of Italian scientists, a father and daughter, Dr. Leonardo and Marissa Leonardo. And what happens very early in the film is that they're trying to find someone who can, like, look into what's going on and like, protect, like, help these injured astronauts. And so they hear that Dr. Leonardo is a doctor, and they get all excited. It's like, yay, we have a doctor, we can heal these men. And then he immediately does I'm not a doctor, I'm, a doctor of zoology. But Marissa is a medical student very near to receiving her MD. So she has most of the know-how she needs to sort of help these people. And her being a competent medical professional and scientist in her own right is not something the film presents as weird or even necessarily worthy of comment. It's just how she gets into the film, and she's good at her job, and that's what that is. And we're still very much in the a lady scientist phase of science fiction movies. So the fact that it's just okay that she's a doctor and it sort of doesn't really get commented upon once it's been established, that's very strange, actually, I think, for a 1957 film in a way that is very progressive, basically, and I think gives Marissa a little bit more heft as a character than a lot of the female leads in these movies do, or have.
Yeah, I would say so, and she's actually kind of an analog for a previous, I think it was a previous Harryhausen movie too. It Came From Beneath the Sea. There's also like a lady marine biologist, but I do think she is a little bit more stared at in goggle-eyed terror from time to time. And the only like particularly sexist moment is when she is trying to help one of the injured astronauts, and the colonel's like, "No, shut up! I know what's going on," and he tells her to stand still and be quiet while he handles things, because it's still 1957.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. Other than that, there is that kind of burgeoning proto-feminist approach to like a woman can do things and be competent, and also she is horny in a way that you don't get in a lot of films of this era. And they actually have a certain amount of chemistry that I appreciated, because their romance arc is given absolutely nothing on the page. But when they're flirting, I actually get kind of a spark between them that I like.
No, that's real. And I mean, does the romance arc ever get the nourishing love it needs in a 50s alien movie?
Oh, no.
Because I would be tempted to say no. There's very much a sense in this film, as in so many films, where, well, you got a chisel-faced man and you've got a curvy lady. Of course they're going to end up screwing, because it's a movie. What else are they going to do? And like that seems to be the bulk of the work the screenwriters have done to lay in the seeds for this this relationship. And certainly the screenplay for 20 Million Miles to Earth is no different. Like, they're not developing a relationship here. It's just kind of like, here they are, and now all of a sudden, oh, well, I guess they've been romantic leads the whole time. But I do think the actors are doing what gets done to sell that, and I certainly don't want to like overemphasize that I think this is something that the film is good at or has really done. It still kind of sneaks up on me when the like Rome rampage happens, and I'm like, oh right, they're a couple now, basically. But I do think you're right. I think there's a level of like very obvious physical attraction that's going on between them that you sort of see in the acting, and that at least helps sort of pave the way for this later development.
Yeah, they're elevating it a lot more than a lot of other people would have chosen to do. And there is a very silly line where she's like kind of bantering with him and says she's been cooking over a hot creature all day, and I'm like, that's a weird thing to say.
I enjoy that line.
Oh,
it's playful, and it shows a level of self-awareness that I think is correct for a movie of this sort that comes out in 1957 at least to have. Mm-hmm. Like I think by that point the cycle of alien movies has gotten pretty long in the tooth, so I think playing around with it is a good thing to have done.
Yeah, and I think that'll put a nice little button on anything worth talking about any of the humans in this movie, unless you have anything to add.
I mean, do you want to say anything more about the little boy with the cowboy hat? Not
really.
He never gets a cowboy hat.
No, he does. He's wearing it.
Does he?
Yeah.
Does he? I don't remember that at all.
Yeah, no.
This, like most Ray Harryhausen films, has an extremely hard time keeping my attention on the screen when there's not a monster on it.
Yes.
So.
No, it was like, even though I enjoyed that romantic subplot to whatever degree it's possible to enjoy it, it's still about 0.03% of the movie, and the human plot is about 40 to 55% of the movie. And it is an especially, I mean, it's just a dull 50s human plot, and look, I don't need them to explain the science of the monster, especially because it doesn't come into play. Like, we're not really trying to find out the weaknesses of the monster in any meaningful way. So when I learn that he's made of tubes and doesn't have lungs or whatever, I'm like, great, show me the monster.
You learn that he doesn't have lungs directly. I think literally the next shot, we see him breathing heavily while he's sedated, which is a delightful error.
Those are just his body tubes expanding or science.
I mean, body tubes expanding describes the process of breathing, in a way. But no, I do want to suggest that I think, so as you say, the human plot, like the what's going on between our two leads is a fairly large chunk of the movie. The monster scenes per se get very little time just because monsters are expensive, especially Harryhausen monsters. But I do think we get a lot of screen time that's given over to the doing of science. Feels like it would be making it sound more grandiose than it is. We're basically watching people like be confused what the hell's happening. But I do think this film does fairly good stuff in terms of the pre-monster waking up and rampaging through Rome. We don't really know what's going on, creating just a sense of sort of wary curiosity. And hearing that it was actually shot in Italy, sort of makes me want to reevaluate a little bit of what's going on in some of these scenes that don't necessarily do anything for our characters' arcs, such as they are, but are just kind of like vibing on Italy, I guess is maybe what I'm now seeing in them. There's a lot of moments in the middle of the film where it's just kind of like there's just this cloud of like what is this creature, what is it going to do, and I think those work for me in a way they often don't. I'm not ever bored watching this movie the way that I am routinely bored watching 50s alien movies.
Okay. Yeah, I hear that. I don't know. I have a very low pain tolerance for scenes in 50s movies where they are just lecturing about the science that isn't real.
Okay, I have an extremely high pain tolerance for those kinds of scenes.
Okay, because I get the...
I'm a Star Trek fan from way back, so I could not possibly not have a tolerance for those kinds of scenes.
Okay, yeah, and I can see where people would have an inroad into enjoying them. It's just not my flavor that I prefer. Like, There's this huge kind of act of Forbidden Planet where he's just describing everything about how the planet works, and that's the part where I'm, like, falling asleep.
See, I guess for me, it's like if I get to choose between watching absolute non-characters pretend like they have personalities, or I can watch those same non-characters give me a little fake science lecture, it is just a much more path of least resistance thing for me for them to just give me a science lecture than for me to pretend that they have, like, inner lives.
Okay, I hear that. I totally get that, especially, like, when there's nothing else to offer. But I guess, for me, the type of 50s film that I prefer is either the Invasion of the Body Snatchers or It Conquered the World kind of paranoia plotline. Or there's kind of a... Every now and again, you would get kind of a women's picture Rosemary's Baby kind of plotline about gaslighting in terms of Attack of the 50-Foot Woman or I Married a Monster from Outer Space, and those are the things that I prefer rather than, like, teams of military scientists are pointing at charts.
That's fair. I guess I'm more making the argument that this, as the team of military scientist film goes, this is a much more watchable version of them. Like,
yes,
again,
yes.
This comes out the same year from the same director as Deadly Mantis. I don't know if you've ever seen The Deadly Mantis.
Not that one, not yet.
It's more like The Deadly Boring.
Oh.
So, I mean, that is a film I have never gotten... I've never tried even to get through it without watching the episode of Mystery Science Theater that's riffing on it. Because that is a movie that is just, like, endless, interminable scenes of people in a lab, like, looking at a real shitty-looking prop. And there's at least some level of atmosphere in 20 Million Miles to Earth. And again, I'm just wondering if that might be mostly or entirely a side effect of the Italian location shoot. But I do get some sense of, like, energy to the scenes of talking and pointing at charts.
No, I totally would not want to disabuse you of that feeling, and it's strong for the thing that it is that I don't really like.
That's fair.
So I'm totally with you. And also, one of this film's strength is that we are spending a lot of time with the monster on the bell curve of this type of film. We get to see the Ymir. Is that what it is?
Yes.
Yeah, we get to see the Emir a lot more than you get to see most of the monsters in any of these movies.
For sure. Certainly, even compared to a lot of other Ray Harryhausen films, I think that the monster shows up earlier and gets a lot more screen time. And the finale, when it's rampaging through Rome, is actually quite protracted.
Yeah.
There's a lot of these films where from the moment the monster breaks out of the lab until the moment that it's like a burning husk of flesh, we'd get maybe 2.5 minutes. Because rampages cost money too. Mm-hmm. And the rampage is like, fully 15 minutes long, I'd say.
Yeah, it is. It is essentially an act. Like, it could be reasonably called an act of the movie.
Agreed, which is quite unusual, I think, for this kind of film. And it's even within the rampage, there's like ebbing and flowing, because like it fights the elephant, as I said, but that's not the climax of the movie. Like, that's kind of a way station towards the climax, and then there's this shot of the elephants like bleeding out, fake elephant, like stop motion elephant, but it's sort of like it has its own kind of climax and its own moment of like, that's a sad moment. Like, I think the movie lingers on the elephant just like lying there breathing in a ragged way, far in excess of what I would expect, a B movie for children from 1957 to feel comfortable doing. And again, I think it gets to this idea that we are meant to feel sorry for these pair of wild animals, basically, the elephant and the Emir, just kind of suffering pointlessly because humans are dumb shits, in a way.
Yeah. No, like, the more you talk about it, the more I kind of get on board with it. And again, I was never not on board with that reading of the movie, because that is how I read it, too.
It's clearly what the movie wants you to read it as. Like, I don't think it's hiding that. Mm-hmm. I think to me, it gets there more than it sounds like, at least initially, you felt that it got there.
Yeah, that's the thing. Because, like, obviously you can't not pick up on the fact that it has sympathy for this monster. But by the end, I wasn't, like, feeling sad that the Emir has been lost to us. Like,
oh, I'm not sad. I'm not watching this film as a tragedy, because there's just not that much to it. But by the same token, I don't know that I feel sad when King Kong dies.
You're overjoyed.
I'm so happy. I just fuck that gorilla.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, okay, so yeah, let's talk about the Emir.
Let's do that.
My one like annoying knee-jerk idiot complaint is that it never really gets that big.
I mean, how big do you need it to get?
I mean, I kind of wanted...
Big enough to fight an elephant?
I a little bit wanted it to kind of tower over the Coliseum at the end and crush things. But That's a kaiju movie, and that's not what it was doing. And everything it was doing is, I wouldn't say top to bottom, but like medium high to bottom, superb.
I have a list on the website that any of you can go out and hunt down, where when Ray Harryhausen passed in 2013, I did several Ray Harryhausen films. This was not among them. But I also did a top 10 list of my favorite monsters from Harryhausen's bestiary. And the Emir is on that list, very high up. I think my number 3 on that list. In Harryhausen's entire filmography, I think 16 movies worth of dinosaurs and spaceships and Medusae and all that good shit. This is my third favorite one of his creatures. I think the Emir is just a phenomenal achievement, and I can go on at that at length, but I don't want to immediately like just steal the momentum you were building. So as you say, a superb creature. What to you works about this creature?
Yes, well, first of all, it's doing stop motion and integrating it in so many different ways that are almost seamless. Like, I would say, obviously, the rampage at the end is really spectacular and really fun, but in terms of how the fuck did they do that, the battle in the barn sequence is breathtaking. Like, the way it kind of effortlessly switches between, like, rear projection into actually interacting with physical objects and people is about as good as anything could possibly be from this time period.
Agreed. I think that, when we talk about Ray Harryhausen as a visual effects artist, obviously the very first place people's mind goes, because why wouldn't it be, is to the quality of the stop motion. And I would flatly declare I think he is the best stop motion animator ever. I think he has such remarkable craft. There's so much fluidity. As we see here, there can be a lot of personality. What I think it's very easy to overlook and that he doesn't get enough credit for, he was one of the best in the business at this point in doing process shots. Like, the layering of film elements and visual effect, and it's all filmed, but like the marriage of these shots, the compositing in it is like off the charts good for the technology level he was working at. I mean, you have to get into like digital compositing techniques in the 1980s to see anybody doing better than I think he was up to at this point. And this is a really good example of it. You mentioned the barn fight, and I think that's a great scene. For me, the one where it just feels like he is flat out showing off, like, look at how good I can do this, is the scene where the little hatchling Ymir, at about foot tall, is kind of wandering back and forth across a table, and Dr. Leonardo is watching it, being just kind of amazed. That is a startlingly good scene to me.
Yeah, it just, like, from the level of the ways that the multiple shots are integrated to the eye lines, to everything just, like, really hitting perfectly. And there's a scene shortly after that where the Emir gets put into a cage that's also really, really interesting to look at. And just to think about how they made any of this possible. I would say there are some dodgier effects when it comes to non-Ymir stuff, because obviously they were saving their budget for that. Like, there's a part where the stones from the Colosseum are falling down, and they are almost fully transparent. They are opaque stones. And
there's also one shot. I think it stands out for being like an unusually noticeably bad shot, where I forget who it is. It must be Calder is standing in front of, like, he's the human character standing in the foreground, and we see the monster sort of attacking a building in the background, and the building is practical, the monster is not, and so the focus starts to fall off as it leaves the human, so it's not a completely deep focus shot, and the building is mostly out of focus, and the Emir is not quite as out of focus. So it almost feels like the shot sort of goes out of focus and then comes back in the background, which is not physically possible. And he was trying to get there. I think he just didn't quite calculate how far out of focus he needed the footage of the monster to go. But that's the only one of the shots of the monster that I think doesn't work. But I do agree with you. Some of the non-monster shots are a little bit less there. And again, as you point out, they know where to spend the money, and they're spending it there.
Yeah. So while we're here, I mean, I think where you were kind of going towards was talking about the actual design, like the character design of the creature. Did you want to speak on that a little bit?
I was actually heading towards the character animation.
Oh, well, do that.
And I would feel comfortable using the phrase character animation, which is both a technical term, but also I think sort of speaking to like the storytelling quality. And this is when I keep harping on the Emir feels like a sympathetic character to me. It's really not in the screenplay. It's really in the animation. There's just so much subtle movement and such a sense of like an animal being aware of its surroundings and reacting to them. And there's that great moment where it sort of leaps back from fire. And I think that's actually in the barn fight, if I'm remembering correctly. Where I get this very clear sense of a sort of like a big dog or cat or something just kind of very carefully working its way around an environment it doesn't quite know. And it's just, there's just so much graceful movement and like thinking movement. And you can tell this is a creature that's sort of thinking and analyzing its environment. And I mean, that's, as I was saying, I love Harryhausen's animating. I think he's a great artist, but a lot of times what I respond to is the technical perfection of his work. And I would think of something like It Came From Beneath the Sea, his movie about a six-legged octopus, that the octopus is just a phenomenal piece of animation. Like from a technical standpoint, he's got all of these tentacles moving independently of each other, and each one of them is moving, these very clever ways. So, like, in terms of managing lots of moving parts, it's a great work of technical craft, but the octopus in that film does not have a personality. It is not an active thinking creature. It's just like a big fucking monster. We get to a point here, and I'm even tempted to say this is the film where it really starts, and I'm going to just quickly pull up his filmography so I know what else I'm looking at. Yeah, this is actually fairly early in Harryhausen's filmography. This is really the first time where he's created a creature that you can actually tell what the creature is thinking. You can say the creature is thinking and have that be like a meaningful phrase, and that to me represents like a real like leveling up of his technique, where it suddenly does feel like I'm watching something thoughtfully interacting with its environment.
Yeah, it's the difference between watching puppetry and then watching the Muppets. Like, the way that life is imbued into the inherently lifeless object. It is the thing that separates like the technique from the art. Like that extra leap.
100%. And I do love that about this creature. I love that about this movie. But I think the design's also super great. And I don't want to skip right past that. This is your basic alien lizard man. So there's a lot of like fairly stock things about this character, but it has like so many details that all feel like they're pointing in the direction of some sort of very well worked out biology that we're not getting the details of, but like it clearly evolved to fit some sort of niche. Like it's got too many parts, basically. Does this creature. And I particularly love its face, which he basically just straight up reused the face of this monster in Clash of the Titans, which was his last film 24 years later, where there's a Kraken of being released fame. And and the Kraken's face is basically the Emir's face. Like, there's really not even an attempt to hide or change it, because that's how good the face is. It's a very expressive, very, very like craggy and interesting and sort of weirdly beaked face that reads as alien, if not alien, certainly inhuman in a way that nevertheless still reads as like, again, we can see what it's thinking. We can like see from its expression, even though it does not feel like a human face.
Yeah, no, basically everything about it is it's designed to work well in this movie and to do all of these exciting things that it's doing. Like, fighting the elephant is such a great sequence, and then well, I'm distracting myself, but the part where the elephant falls and they crush a car is also like a really cool, just the ways that they're interacting with the things around them too. Like everything is kind of working together to make it feel like it actually is a thing that's coming into the real world, that is alive.
Right, which is another thing that I feel like Ray Harryhausen was really, really great at, and my favorite example of that from his entire career is in the film Mysterious Island from 1961. He has his like giant monster chicken creature jump over a fence, and it kicks the fence post. And if you were watching this with like live action stunt work, you would say, ooh, the stuntman fucked up and kicked that fence post. Like, it doesn't feel narratively consequential. It's even slightly distracting. But it was so important to get that, like, it is interacting with the set. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's like his best moment there. But no, I think this is a really, really good example of that sort of tendency in the effects work as well. And he's still just starting to play around with that. I think he really starts doing that the year prior to this in Earth versus the Flying Saucers, which is a kind of a weird outlier for Harryhausen in that it doesn't have creatures. It just basically has spaceships, and the spaceships are pretty straightforward. So in a sense, it's kind of slightly boring if you're looking at it wanting a very cool stop-motion animated effect sequence. But because the flying saucers are so straightforward and they can be done so effortlessly, he really started to get interested in like what are some of the things you can do around just the stop motion animation itself. So that's where he starts really coming up with these really good composite shots, but also starts really working on ways that he can have the effects interact with a live action environment. And I think that pays off here. This is I think self-evidently a better film than Earth versus the Flying Saucers, and the Emir is a much more compelling, not just character, but compelling visual effect. Like, it feels in the story world in a way that is very unusual, I'd say, for a stop-motion creature at this point. And again, sort of how you were saying, the way it just, like, interacts with the environment is a big part of that.
Yeah, and that's really important for realism, because your effects could be as good as possible, but there's got to be something that is relatable at this kind of intimate human level to really, really sell that kind of thing. Like, you know, not to like totally throw off the train of thought here, but like for example, like when Tom Savini did there's the raft massacre in The Burning, where Cropsey has those garden shears and is killing a bunch of teenagers. The first thing that you see, the first swipe with the garden shears doesn't hit anyone. It nicks the side of the raft, and you can see the metal shears like kind of tearing off a piece of the wood. And that cues your brain into thinking this is a real thing. Like that kind of small interaction is something that my brain can understand, even if it can't understand being stabbed in the chest with garden shears. So once those worst things are happening, it feels all the more real because of that tiny thing. And those are the things that Ray Harryhausen is starting to pepper in here, and that's what makes it so valuable to sell the weight and heft and danger of this creature.
Absolutely. And it's amazing, like, not just that he's starting to do that, but how well he is at doing it already by 57. Again, especially in that barn fight that you were talking about, like, there's so much environmental interaction that has to happen there, not just in terms of, like, props, but in terms of lighting. And lighting is always, even today, here in the year of our Lord 2022, lighting is the enemy of visual effects. Like, it's just really hard to match. And he's showing off with that. Like I said, there's a fire moment, and I was talking about it in terms of, like, it's a cool bit of character animation. It's also, I get to the character animation because he has done such a good job of selling firelight on his prop, and firelight that matches firelight that's in the live action footage with the actors.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
It's truly a startling thing to behold. If you know anything about how movies get made, like it just becomes the more amazing to consider. Well, is there anything else about the effects that you want to point out? Because it's largely incredible, but it's kind of all doing the same thing. Like,
that's the thing. There's highlight moments, and there's always the moments that you want to highlight in one of these films. But it's really good technique. He was a really good animator, and that's what it comes down to. He mostly worked by himself or with a very small crew. I'm not sure in 57 if he was working with a small crew or not. So he's just like fussing over this, basically being given carte blanche. Like, Charles Schneer understood the star of the show is Ray Harryhausen. It's not the director, it's not the actors, it's not the story. And really gave him a pretty wide latitude to develop and execute these effect scenes. And he was just really good at it. And, like, to a certain extent, that's where you have to land on, is like, no, he was maybe the single best technician in the history of stop motion animation. Like, the number of ways he moves his puppets and the precision with which he calculates those movements. There are exceptions, even at the very end of his career, there are exceptions to what I'm about to say. He more than any other stop motion animator that I can name, just avoids the sort of, and I say this with love for the form, but the jankiness, you know, the kind of, like, you can feel, like, the sort of shifts and the jerkiness. He doesn't have that. Like, you look at his stuff and it's just really, really fluid. And I've never understood why, because, like, you know, 20, 30 years after this, people would start figuring out ways to, like, introduce little tricks to, like, get rid of that jerkiness, and Harryhausen's basically doing it just by hand. It's ludicrous. I love
Yeah,
it.
he's doing it by hand with his middle finger raised, just like... Yeah, no, and that completely elevates this movie, because without him, 20 Million Miles to Earth is nothing. It's not a movie.
Oh, it's nothing.
Yeah.
It's one of 1,000. What is this alien creature? I.e., this alien creatures tearing down our buildings and murdering us. There's so many of those movies. This one is maybe more interesting in that it's set in Italy. It's maybe more interesting in that it has a very competent woman scientist. But the story's still not there. The characters still aren't there. So what sells this movie is the monster, and they know that. They knew that in 57.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it is a particularly excellent monster. If I was rating it just on effects, I'd be giving it an even higher rating. Like, everything else kind of dragged it down to at least half a tick for me. I gave it a 7 out of 10.
I'm the same. I'm a 3.5 star on this.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, but it's like, I'd say 99% of that rating is just Ray Harryhausen.
Oh, I mean, I am not sure if any one of the films for which he provided the visual effects, there's not a single one of them where he's not my favorite element, and I'm not certain if there's a single one of them that I would feel compelled to watch if he wasn't involved. Maybe Mysterious Island.
It does have a lot of shirtless men on an island.
I mean, it does, but it also has Herbert Lom wearing a shirt, but wearing a shirt with great maniacal like presence, and I like that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, as I'm scanning over his career, I guess 1 million BC, 1 million years BC is a fun movie, even without the dinosaurs. But like, even something that I cherish as much as I cherish Jason and the Argonauts, that is not a watchable film. It doesn't end. It doesn't have a like resolution. It just stops.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're really swooping in with the extremely piping hot take that Ray Harryhausen is very good at what he does.
So one thing I do want to touch on, because we sort of teased it way back at the start of this episode. Brennan, we run a horror podcast.
That is true. I've heard about this.
Was this a horror movie?
I mean, insofar as in the 1950s in America, this is as close as we were really getting creature features were. Because right about now is the time that Hammer is kind of peeking its head over in England.
This is the year that Curse of Frankenstein comes out, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so that is where horror is going to kind of be turning to, and then obviously Psycho comes out in 1960 and blows everything up. But after the universal run of the 30s and 40s, like the B picture is the genre kind of died in the US. No, I mean the horror genre. Mm-hmm. It, or at least went into hibernation, and this is the thing that those kids who would have been flocking to the Universal movies would have been seeing. So it's as close as you're gonna get, I think.
I would agree, and I think there's a clear, you can slice it off at 1945 or 1946 if you want to make sure you catch all the stragglers, where what we think of as horror as it developed in sound cinema and very prominently in English language cinema in the 1930s, World War II ends. And sort of the like pop psychology, pop sociology explanation is that people had just gotten through a war. It was very violent. It was horrible. We started seeing the footage of like the concentration camps, and people just didn't want it anymore. Like, they didn't want horror. They wanted escapist fare that didn't involve like being entertained by bloody death. And that might be true. That seems a little pat to me, but
yeah,
it is certainly the case.
Well, especially because so many of these films are about how nuclear proliferation is going to kill us all. That doesn't seem like a totally solid reading.
Exactly. And so we have this period basically from 46 until, I mean, you mentioned Psycho, and that might very well be where I end it. 1946 through 58, 59, 60. Horror basically doesn't exist in the Anglosphere, at least not as we think of horror. And I do think, you mentioned nuclear proliferation. My reading, and this is hardly news. This is everyone's reading. Horror is role is to like give the audience kind of a place to work through what is scary about life. And what is scary about life in the 50s is nuclear war. And so we just see dozens and dozens of films about nuclear monsters. I mean, that's its own subgenre as well. You've got giant nuclear insects, giant nuclear lizards, you name it. So I think these are filling the ecological niche that horror fills. And to a certain extent, I mean, it is a monster movie, right? Like, monsters are part of the horror genre. It seems kind of hard to, like, mentally go back in a way that, like, I can go back to a horror film from the 30s and they don't scare me at all. But I'm like, yeah, that was a horror film. I go back to a film like this, or a film like Them, or a film like The Incredible Shrinking Man. They are horror. Like, they're talking about, like, the sort of the terrifying things that get people worried about being alive in a way that feels off kilter for the genre to me, but I don't know where else to put them. And this is, I think, where horror is like creeping out in the 1950s, is in films like this.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. Like, they're just like, the Venn diagrams aren't quite kissing, but it's as close as you can get. And I would say 20 Million Miles to Earth is, I mean, there are films in that subgenre that are closer to being horror, because the Ymir is not really victimizing humans too much.
Not really.
Even when it is on a rampage. So I'd say, like, you know, movies like Them, or, you know, the paranoia thrillers, like I was talking about, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, or even Invaders from Mars, where it's like there's this creeping suspicion that something terrible is going on that you're not quite sure how to suss it out. Like, those definitely get a lot closer. And then obviously, like, I think this isn't the U.S., this is not the Anglosphere, but, like, Godzilla is a horror film. Like, that is not primarily, but the tone and atmosphere in which it's working is horror.
100%.
And shoot, I thought of another 50s movie at the time that's a little closer to what I was thinking, but it's out of my brain, whatever. But just when the things are eating people, we get a little closer, too. There's a little more of that palpable sense of danger and fear and death. But, you know, if I have a friend who's coming over and is like, let's watch a horror movie, no, I'm not putting on 20 Million Miles to Earth. But if you're trying to dig through the 50s and find that genre, this is where it is.
I would put it this way. I don't think this is any less worthy of the name horror than the Creature from the Black Lagoon trilogy. And we've always allowed Universal to call those part of their Monsters franchise. So I think if we let those be horror, then we sort of have to let this be horror too.
Yeah. No, I'm cool with that. And look, I have a very open heart as far as what I will consider horror, because I do want to be able to cover more things on these types of shows and, you know, the horror things that I do.
For sure.
That's purely selfish, but whatever. Anyway, speaking of not particularly horror, next time you catch us... Well, is there anything else you want to say about this movie? I felt like we...
I don't think so. I think we've covered it.
Okay, cool. Next time, we're going to be doing one more Ray Harryhausen. We're covering The Valley of Guangzhi in 2 weeks.
Which is a delightful film for which I think this horror conversation will be much shorter and will involve much fewer attempts to justify calling it that, because I think we'll just be like, it's not... This is a good dinosaur picture, but it's a good dinosaur picture.
Okay,
so.
Well, I'm excited about that. I've not seen The Valley of Guangzhi. I hadn't seen either of these. I'm a little undernourished on Harryhausen. Like, I've seen the Pillars.
I don't want to pin you down, but can you very quickly tell me which ones you have seen?
Clash of the Titans. It Came from Beneath the Sea. The Mysterious Island, and clips from Jason and the Argonauts. But I've not seen the entire movie.
Okay, but none of the three Sinbads?
No.
And not 1 Million Years BC?
No.
Okay. Good to know.
No, I'm working on it. My boyfriend is a stop motion person, so he would be very excited to go on this journey with me, and it's going to happen at some point.
I think it is. I have seen every one of his films other than this very peculiar one-off called The Animal World, which is actually a documentary about animals, and when they talk about dinosaurs as a type of animal, it has like a 7-minute Ray Harryhausen dinosaur sequence.
Oh.
But I haven't seen it. It sounds strange, and no one really likes it. Like many of his films, it's only good because of the stop motion. Unlike many of his films, all the stop motion is concentrated in one chunk in the middle.
Yeah, it's just a short film.
It's never been tip top of my list of things that I want to see.
No, that's totally fair. But yeah, no, I'm excited that Gavin suggested this. It's definitely allowing me to be exposed to, especially ones that are not his biggest ones, which are what I'm more interested in anyway.
Totally.
But yeah, so we'll see you next time for the Valley of Guangzhi. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you can go at It's Raining Brens. If you can follow both of us on Letterboxd, all of our social stuff is going to be in.
Yes, I was about to say, if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can go screw.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't recommend it. He's there.
Technically, I am. You can technically follow me on Twitter.
The ghost of Tim Brayton.
If you want to be just horribly let down by what you find out.
Lurks in the shadows of Twitter. You can tag him in everything, and he will not notice. But yeah, and follow, find more of Tim's reviews and mine at alternateending.com, and that would be very nice of you. I just reviewed The Bubble. That. It was very bad.
I am so excited to watch The Bubble without having to think about what I would review it. I just want to watch and be angry at it.
You're welcome for freeing you from that burden. Anyway, thank you so much. We'll see you all in 2 weeks, and bye.
Thanks, everybody.